Today we're going to be continuing on our discussion of forestry, and we're going to focus particularly on old growth forests and on deforestation. We're looking here at an image of an old growth forest as a starter. These are the coast redwoods of Northern California, which attain among the greatest age of any organisms on Earth. These trees are well over 1,000 years old, in fact. And so let's start with this topic of old growth and consider it a bit. Now, those coast redwoods are very impressive trees, as you could see from those tiny little people standing next to them. But compared to these trees, they were small. The coast redwoods were in the vicinity of 200 plus feet tall. These trees are Douglas firs from the Pacific Northwest in Washington State. And these trees are in the vicinity, the tallest ones are in the vicinity of 400 feet tall. Trees that are twice as big as those redwoods, among the biggest organisms on the planet. And these were also extremely ancient. At least some of them were pushing 2,000 years old. Now, of course, stands of trees like these are now rather limited in extent. Most have long since been logged off. Most of the remaining ones exist on state and national parkland. And indeed, the pictures that you're looking at here both come from national park and national forest land. Now, in the east, old growth forest is even in more limited extent than it is in the west. This is a photograph from the Adirondack Mountains of northern New York State, where there are still some little pockets of old growth trees. This is a yellow birch. And although yellow birch is a common eastern tree, I had never seen one like this before. This tree was probably several hundred years old. Most of the yellow birches we see have smooth, kind of orangey yellow peeling bark. I had never seen one that had attained an age great enough so that its bark attained this flaky kind of an appearance. Notice that there's another yellow birch right behind it of the same kind of stature. So in the east, there are these little patches that remain, and in some instances there are just scattered trees. Most of the Adirondack Mountains have long since been logged off, just like in the west, but you can find little groves here and there. Here is another stand of eastern hardwood trees. These are oaks in New Jersey, and a stand of trees that is not only old growth, but a virgin stand. That is, it has never been altered by humans. And this particular stand has a pretty well documented history, so that we know that no logging, no disturbance of any appreciable degree has ever occurred here. It is one of the few isolated stands of these kinds of trees that you can find anywhere in the Northeast that is truly a virgin stand of timber. We're looking mostly at oaks here, trees that are well over 100 feet tall, which for the east is quite large. Now here's a stand that is a bit more typical of what we find in the east that is representative of old growth. This is a stand of white pines in northwestern Connecticut that we've actually visited previously in other programs. These trees, although they are what we could call old growth, usually we distinguish old growth in the east as being trees greater than 160 years. That's kind of a rule of thumb, but it's a reasonable approximation. When trees get that age, they are attaining maximum size for most of our eastern species. These white pines are in excess of 200 years old, And this stand also, like the last one, has a pretty well documented history. This one, however, although the trees may be called old growth, it's not a virgin stand in that it has had forest management, which has actually benefited these white pines by having them grow wider and therefore be more stable. Now, not all old growth stands of trees consist of huge specimens, however. We're looking here at a mountaintop in the Berkshire Mountains of the western Massachusetts, Connecticut area. And we're looking at these little stunted scrub oaks in the foreground and some equally stunted, not very tall pitch pines in the background. These trees, until fairly recently, were pretty much ignored. They were thought to just be the consequence of reforestation of these mountaintops after the era of colonial farming. But then someone got the bright idea to take a core of one of these trees, and they turned out to be in excess of 200 years old. So again, old growth, and in fact these systems probably are rather like virgin systems as well. It appears that not much disturbance has ever occurred on these mountaintops. And so what we are looking at here is rather like what the Pilgrims would have seen had they made the trek out here and climbed these mountains 300 plus years ago. In the harsh kinds of conditions that you find on these mountain peaks with very thin soil, limited nutrients, extra cold in the wintertime because of their elevation. We're talking about peaks that are several thousand feet in elevation. Conditions are harsh enough that trees grow very slowly here, and so it's deceptive. One might think that they're just young, scrubby trees that came in after a disturbance, but in fact they are trees of great age. Before we move on to our next topic, let's take a trip to the tropics and take a look at tropical rainforest. We're looking here at old growth tropical rainforest canopy in Southeast Asia. And here I am standing next to one of these trees on a tropical Pacific island. This is a old growth breadfruit tree that grew to over 100 feet tall, and you can see how big it is. It must be a good 5 feet wide based on my height there. This, however, like we saw in the east, was one of just a few old growth trees that remained after most of this particular area had been long since logged off. As with temperate old growth, tropical old growth has also sustained very heavy logging, so that old growth patches are rather limited around the world as well. Let's conclude our brief trip to the tropics by looking at this image here of old growth Hawaiian forest. And again, like elsewhere in the tropics and elsewhere around the world, most old growth in Hawaii is long gone, although in this instance not only because of human activity. Many of the Hawaiian Islands are still volcanic, and volcanic activity also tends to renew the landscape, so that many of the forests that you see in the Hawaiian Islands are relatively young because they grew after a lava flow. These particular trees formed a little copse of growth between lava flows that had managed to persist for quite a long period of time. So these were rather large trees as Hawaiian trees grow. These, by the way, are koa trees, which is one of the more common and important forest trees of the Hawaiian Islands. You'll also notice some young tree ferns in this photo. So let's summarize a few points about old growth and add a few additional observations as well. In that photograph of the Douglas fir, you may have noticed a dead tree in the foreground. That is something that you do see in old growth. You do have death of trees leading to forest gaps. And this leads to heterogeneity of old growth ecosystems. There are a number of kinds of species of both plants and animals that actually have evolved to exploit those forest gaps. There's a whole group of bird species, for example, that are thought of as forest gap specialists. Old growth may or may not, however, be more diverse than younger forests. Often we assume that old growth is the most diverse system, but that's not necessarily true at all. In fact, in a number of systems that have been studied, diversity actually declines as forest ecosystems attain great age. Some of the kinds of species that are present in younger stands are at a competitive disadvantage, and so they tend to decline or disappear. In certain kinds of situations, certain kinds of old growth can be rather low in diversity. In fact, old growth hemlock stands in the Northeast tend to be rather low in diversity. There's not that much that can grow under hemlocks. They tend to overwhelm other species. They are very strong competitors, and so they can form pure stands in the right kinds of situations, usually in coves, in moister stream valleys, and places like that. They have a real competitive advantage over a lot of other northeastern species. Old growth species also tend to be those that are capable of replacing themselves in shade. And we saw that in our last program as well. In the Northeast, species like maples and beeches and hemlocks tend to be better competitors in these situations. So over time, they tend to come to predominate. Although you'll notice that that old growth stand in New Jersey was still mostly oaks. And as we go further south in milder conditions, the oaks would appear to have some competitive advantages over species that are in their continental distribution more associated with northern cooler climates. And so in the middle Atlantic states, the oaks do seem to persist longer than they would, say, in New England in forest ecosystems. One other aspect of old growth systems that research has demonstrated is that in certain of these, and probably in many of them, the variety of herbaceous plant species tends to be greater, as well as the diversity of soil organisms, various kinds of animal life, tends to be greater in these systems. Here, for example, is an orchid that I have only found growing in fairly mature old growth kinds of situations here in Connecticut. This is an orchid called orchis that otherwise seems to be rather hard to find in our forest systems. Now let's turn our attention a bit to what we might think of as being the opposite of old growth forests, and that is tree plantations, human associated forests, trees that people plant. Here in New England, especially conifers get planted, although also in the southeastern U.S., conifers tend to be the preferred species. And in much of the western U.S. as well, conifers tend to be the preferred species in intensively managed agricultural kinds of forests. This is one kind of a stand that we see planted. These are Norway spruces, which grow quite large, quite fast. They do tend to be a bit of a short-lived species, and they do have some problems with disease, but they have been historically planted here as a crop that can produce a relatively short rotation in terms of producing harvestable lumber. The problem with planting one species of tree is very similar to the kind of situation we see in other branches of agriculture. When you have monocultures, you're just inviting invasion by pests and disease. And plantations of Norway spruce see that. Here in the Northeast, one that has been particularly strongly affected has been the red pine. We're looking here at an image of red pines from their native range. They tend to be a tree of northern latitudes, so northern New England here in the Northeast, for example. This is a stand of red pines in Maine, where they continue to do pretty well. But in the early years of the 20th century, especially during the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps planted red pines south of their native range, all over Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. And although they are a good timber tree and they grow fast, when they were planted in monocultures like this, they left themselves wide open to diseases that could get going south of the native range. And at this point, in the early 21st century, most of those plantations from the 1930s have now died as a consequence of disease. Here's an image that shows you what many of these stands look like now. So in short, although it may make some economic sense to put in plantations of single species, often from an ecological sense and from an agricultural sense, it's not such a great idea because of the likelihood that disease will destroy these kinds of stands. Now let's turn our attention to the topic of deforestation, which we will consider for the rest of today's program. We're looking here at a stand of forest that has been largely eliminated. It's the kind of look of forested areas that have been logged over, and the remaining sapling trees have been damaged by the falling larger trees. Although exactly what a logged over stand would look like would depend a lot upon the kind of practice that was used and how professionally the loggers handled their operation. This stand that you're looking at here, however, was actually not deforested by people. This is a stand in central Massachusetts that was struck by a tornado. And so the deforestation here one could think of as being natural. Although by and large around the world, natural deforestation has not been the issue. It has been the hand of humans cutting down trees that has turned vast swaths of once forested land into open country to be used for other things, urbanization, agriculture, things like that. So when we think of it on the global scale, deforestation has been a very large net negative for planet Earth when one considers the amount of carbon sequestered in forests, when one considers the action of these forests at generating oxygen and recycling nutrients, etc. This, for the planet as a whole, has not been a good thing. However, at a more local scale and at a more intelligent kind of a scale, the kind of things that forest managers do, as we also talked about in our last program, that kind of deforestation is really quite another issue. So when we're talking about selective logging or clear cutting with intent to replant, those kinds of uses of forest land, when managed properly, can be quite sustainable. Clear cutting and selective cutting can be parts of wildlife management programs. as we've also discussed in more depth in previous episodes. However, deforestation can lead to a whole host of problems. This image here is of an area that was once a freshwater swamp that was completely logged off as part of highway construction, and you can see all that bare earth. Well, when you log off something like a swamp and leave bare earth, that can lead to erosion issues. It also tends to lead to a huge loss of nutrients from an area. All the nutrients that would have been recycled in this system wind up in the water of the swamp, and as stream flow through the swamp takes that water elsewhere, it tends to take the nutrients with it. Now in this image we're looking also at a black plastic fence kind of a thing in the foreground. That is a technique which is used to help control erosion. So those are called erosion fences. Often they're done in conjunction with hay bales, and they help to keep soil from eroding into streams. Now if we look at this infrared aerial image here, we see another aspect of deforestation that is a significant issue again throughout the world. We're looking here at a landscape from southern New England. In the center of the field of view we're looking at a large freshwater marsh, and then surrounding it, or at least formerly surrounding it, was forest. But over the years that forest has been compromised. Now I remember this area back in the 1970s when the forest surrounding this marsh was pretty much contiguous unbroken forest, especially that larger patch of forest at the lower end of the image. There were no houses, no buildings. It was just unbroken forest. And in the intervening 40 years since then, quite a few houses have broken that forest canopy. And if we look at the upper part of the image, we see that there are fields and all sorts of things, roads, that further break up that forest. This is the phenomenon of forest fragmentation. Forest fragmentation makes forests not work the way they used to, and this has been well documented by a whole variety of different kinds of research. So contiguous forests, if we think just in terms of wildlife, support populations of species that are not necessarily present at all in fragmented forest. And even if they do manage to persist in those fragmented forests, in many cases they can no longer sustainably produce young, so that reproductive success drops off significantly. Quite a few interior forest birds fall under this heading. So species like this one here, the red-eyed vireo, is a classic forest interior species. And when forest canopies are broken up, the reproductive success of species like this tends to go down, so that in areas that have been opened up, nest predators can get in, and nest parasites like brown-headed cowbirds tend to get in and lay eggs in the nests of the vireos, further reducing their reproductive success. So the effects are quite subtle and insidious, but the overall consequence of forest fragmentation can be profound. But let's focus back on that marsh adjacent to the forest. When we start cutting down the trees in the forest adjacent to the marsh, the nutrients that are being recycled in that forest system tend to escape from it in rainwater runoff and in streams and so on, and they make it into that river that bisects that marsh, thereby providing a nutrient load that was previously not present in that water, which leads to things like algal blooms that wouldn't have been present previously. So changing the nature of that system. Also, if we think in terms of the wildlife that inhabit that marsh, and that is why I have this image, because I studied the wildlife in that marsh for many years. Once they are no longer surrounded by this buffer of natural habitat, when they are instead in a system where there is much more human disturbance and there are dogs and cats coming down to the marsh, all these animals associated with people, then the environment is also no longer what it was. And so one can also expect not only the forest community, but also adjacent natural communities can suffer from the consequences of fragmentation of that forest by human activity. Now let's back up and look at a wider scale. We're looking here at a U.S. Geological Survey topographic map of a portion of central Connecticut, not too far removed from that last infrared image. Look at the green in that image. You'll see one big patch of green over on the left, but then lots of little patches. The green corresponds to forested areas. Central Connecticut is rather heavily populated. Connecticut is in fact one of the most densely populated states in the nation. And so in central Connecticut, the forest has been deeply fragmented, and that has led to significant changes in the kinds of ecological processes that occur in these forests. Where you have small patches of forest, that means that correspondingly you have lots of forest edge. And forest edge tends to be a way for predators to get into these forests. So reproductive success, again, for things like birds tends to decline. There's also an interesting study published just a few years ago looking at food resources for birds that demonstrated that forest patches had inferior quality food available for forest interior birds than did large contiguous tracts of forest. That was actually rather surprising. That was quite an interesting finding. So the more we study this phenomenon of fragmentation, the more insidious its effects appear to be. Some species simply die out from these fragmented systems. Others, as I mentioned, hang on but no longer have viable populations. Populations in some of these little tracts are simply maintained by immigration of individuals from more healthy populations elsewhere. That phenomenon called the source sink phenomenon that we talked about many episodes back. One can observe that quite clearly in some of these little fragmented patches of remaining forest. So let's end today by summarizing some of the effects of deforestation. In a general kind of a way, we can expect that deforestation and forest fragmentation will lead to loss of biodiversity. Species associated with forest interiors often will simply vacate an area. They no longer find the habitat recognizable as a suitable habitat, or indeed are unable any longer to make a living in that fragmented habitat. Deforested watersheds tend to lose nutrients in stream runoff. When the sun is able to hit what was once the forest floor, it tends to dry it out, so soil moisture tends to decline. The humidity that's associated with the forest interior, when that forest canopy is gone, things dry out. Let's take a look at a tropical forest for a minute. We're looking here at a tropical forest in the humid parts of the tropics. This particular forest I studied at some length, and that large tree you're looking at is a tree called Pisonia. The Pisonia tree, to a very large degree, reproduces not by producing seeds, but by vegetative reproduction. As it drops branches, the branches that land on the ground in this shady, humid environment root and grow into new trees. And one can demonstrate that although this is a very effective means of reproduction within the forest, in the adjacent areas that don't have this forest cover, that are subjected to the baking heat of the sun, there is no Pisonia reproduction. So it's unable to recolonize these areas. Now, as we've also seen, soil erosion can be an issue in deforested areas. And as I've hinted at, by no longer sequestering carbon in the trunks of the trees, by not using carbon dioxide in photosynthesis, we can expect that greater concentrations of carbon dioxide remain in the atmosphere, and this is one of the most potent gases associated with retaining thermal energy on the planet. Hence it leads to global warming. And on that point, we will end for today, and we will say a few more words about forestry next time, and then we will move on to the topic of rangeland.